Hi, Christian Gamer here with an introduction to the Bible series. Before I start though, I want to introduce myself. I'm not anything special. I'm not an apostle or a teacher or a pastor or anything like that. I'm just an ordinary Christian who reads his Bible and wants to share his insights. I've been fielding a number of questions on social media lately, which has led me to believe there is an increasing number of people who are considering becoming a Christian and don't know where to begin. So I'm making these videos to help out. Obviously, you don't need these videos because God has made it possible for anyone to find him who earnestly seeks him. But I hope these videos will help you avoid some of the wrong turns and dead ends on your journey so that you don't have to learn the hard way just as I did. So without further ado, let's get into it. And in this video we're picking up in part 3, the Word of God, an introduction to the Bible. If you'll recall with our roadmap, in part 1, we did Where Do We Start? Choosing a Bible and a church, and we answered the seeker's dilemma of I need a Bible in order to know what's the right church, but I need a church in order to know how to read my Bible. In part 2, we answered, do I really need a church? And we looked at the definition of a church, what a church really is, and why we should be going to church. And today we're going to look at the Word of God, an introduction to the Bible. Okay, so the basics of the Bible. In this introduction, I want to help you steer clear of some of the pitfalls people make when they come to the Bible for the first time. We've all done it, we all wind up regretting it, wishing we knew then what we know now. I hope this will help you avoid those pitfalls. So I'm going to give you the information I wish I had known when I first started reading the Bible. So if you don't have a Bible, not to worry. There are plenty of online Bibles to choose from. If you haven't already watched part 1 and 2, I strongly advise you to do so, as these contain information about choosing a Bible and a church, as well as the importance of actually going to church to get a mature mentor to help you guide you through the challenges of coming to the Bible for the first time and help you put the words of the Bible into practice. Assuming you have watched the first 2 videos, let's go ahead and pick a Bible for home devotionals. For those who are new to the faith, I strongly recommend a highly paraphrased Bible, such as the Good News Bible or Good News Translation or Today's English Bible. It's all the same Bible, just with different names. Or the Message or the New Living Translation. If after watching this video you navigate to the Bible Gateway website, I'll put a link in the comments, you can read the text of those Bibles, but having a physical copy is extremely helpful, but by no means essential. Many people find physical Bibles easier on the eyes, but the choice between physical Bible and electronic Bible is a matter of personal choice, not divinely ordained rules. I'll leave a link in the comments to navigate to the Bible Gateway website. Firstly, the Bible is not a single book. Very often when we think of the Bible, we think of it as a book. Indeed, it is often called the good book. But the Bible isn't a book, it's a library or collection of books, ranging from 66 to 81 different books. Actually, in some churches there's even 84. Some quite long, others really short. The books are written by more than 40 different authors over a roughly 2,000 year period and brought together into a single collection. The Bible is made up of legislation, history, poetry, proverbs, that's wisdom writings, prophecy, and something known as apocalyptic writing, which beguile and confound even experienced Christians. You want to save that last bit for after you've read everything else. So why do the number of books differ from Bible to Bible? There are, broadly speaking, 3 different types of Bibles: Catholic, Orthodox and Protestant. Catholic Bibles are used by Catholics, a type of church that considers the authority of the Bible to be on the same level as the authority of the Church. The Bibles they recommend contain 73 books. Now, Orthodox Bibles are used by Orthodox Christians. Like the Catholics, they consider the authority of the Bible to be on the same level as the authority of the Church. Prior to 1054, the Catholics and Orthodox churches were one and the same, but they split in what's known as the Great Schism. The nitty-gritty of the grievances they have with each other is outside the scope of this introduction series. The main difference, as far as we are concerned, is that they tend to be more autonomous than the Catholics and have between 81 and 84 books in their Bibles, depending on which Orthodox tradition they are following. Protestant Bibles are used by a large number of different churches, for example Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, to name just a few of the many hundreds of different types of churches, who are collectively known as Protestant because they protested against the authority of the Catholic Church. Unlike Catholics and Orthodox Christians, they consider the authority of the Bible to be absolute, a teaching known as sola scriptura, or Bible alone. In other words, the Church has no authority other than that given to it by the Bible, which is the Word of God. They have in the Bibles the fewest number of books and the most rigorous standards for what books are considered Holy Scripture versus what books are considered good for reading but not inspired by God. In this video, which is already going to run long, and congratulations if you do make it to the end, I have restricted discussion to just 66 books found in the Protestant Bibles. These are the editions most commonly found in bookstores, hotel rooms and libraries throughout the West. Since all Christian churches agree on these 66 books, they represent the common core of the Christian faith. The Bible is the Word of God. This is what we are taught in church, and it is emphasised. People will show you scriptures like 2 Timothy 3:16-17 and Proverbs 30 verse 5 and 2 Peter 1:20-21 and similar, and often they will leave it at that. They might, if you're really lucky, tell you the Gospel of John is 21 short chapters and can be read in 7 days if you read 3 chapters a day, or in 3 weeks if you read just 1 chapter a day. This is great advice, by the way, and it forms the start of my own reading plan. But what happens after that? Many of us are left not knowing what to do. So here are some huge mistakes, 4 huge mistakes we can make when we go into the Bible for the first time. Most mature Christians can identify with at least one of these mistakes, though many, I'm sure, just like me, can identify with all of them. And the first big mistake is trying to read the Bible cover to cover like an ordinary book. The second big mistake is starting with the end to find out how it turns out, like a murder mystery. The third big mistake is praying for insight and letting the Bible fall open to some random page, and some Christians are still stuck on that big mistake. 4 is follow a Bible in a year plan. I'm not saying you shouldn't do these things. In fact, I would encourage people who have been in the faith for a while to try all of the above. But they all presuppose some knowledge of what you are reading. So save them for after you have read and have a basic understanding of the Bible. When you are coming to the Bible for the first time, this is not the way to go about understanding the Bible. It is, however, a great way to get confused or discouraged and spend your whole Christian life depending on whoever is leading the service at church to bottle feed you spiritual insights. So a quick overview. We can divide the Bible into 3 broad categories of books. We will further refine them into the individual sections. This will give you a broad overview of the Bible, so you know what you're reading. In this video, I will exclusively be talking about the Protestant Bible, as it is the basic Bible that all churches agree on. There are other Bibles out there, namely Orthodox and Catholic Bibles, but these additional books should be left to more advanced videos and are outside the scope of this introduction series. For more mature Christians, you can look at my series on Can We Trust the Bible, parts 3 and 4, where I discuss the canonization of the books of the Bible, which include the Apocrypha. Okay, so the anatomy of the Protestant Bible. It consists of two testaments, the Old Testament, which has 39 books, and the New Testament, which has 27 books. And I've listed them on this slide. You can pause the video if you really want to look at them, but there's not much point to it. The important thing is that the 39 books, starting with Genesis and ending with Malachi, are the Old Testament. And then there's about a 400-year gap. And then we've got the New Testament starting with Matthew and ending in Revelation. Okay, so the anatomy of the Old Testament. The Old Testament contains 39 books written by 29 different authors with various styles that can be broken down as follows. So Law, otherwise known as Pentateuch, Penta meaning 5, these are the 5 books of Moses. They're Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. And then we have the history or narrative books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. And then we have poetry and wisdom, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, also known as Song of Songs. And then we have the 5 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel and Daniel, which we can split into pre-exilic and post-exilic, but we'll look at that later. And then the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi. Again, they can be split into pre-exilic and post-exilic. Again, we'll look at that later. Now, the major prophets are not called major prophets because they're more important. They're just called major prophets because the books are longer. They wrote a lot more. So the anatomy of the New Testament. The New Testament contains 27 books written by 9 different authors with various styles that can be broken down as follows. We have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. History, which is Acts. The Pauline epistles or letters written by Paul. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus and Philemon. And then the general epistles, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd and 3rd John and Jude. And the Apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation that most people have heard about for its very strange imagery. Please don't read Revelation as the first book you read of the Bible. Read it last. It's put last in the Bible for a reason. Read everything else before you read Revelation. Please. It's a huge mistake to jump straight into Revelation. So, general overview of the literary types. Not every book in the Bible can be read the same way. They were written in different styles and need different interpretive styles to understand them. So narrative or history, that's books such as Genesis and Acts are just examples. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy are also narrative and history, as is Joshua. I've already been through those. Now, you can read it as a story of what happened, not necessarily as a command of what to do. There are some parts of the Bible that do contain commands, and they're generally written within the other literary types, but they are put as commands. It does signpost that they're commands by saying that God commanded this. Now we have poetry and wisdom. Books like Psalms and Proverbs are examples of those books. These are an emotional expression and general truths, not rigid if-then formulas or scientific data. And then we have epistles or letters like Romans and Ephesians. These are specific advice written to a specific audience needing context to apply today. We write letters today. Well, we generally dash off emails, don't we? But it's the same sort of principle. You wouldn't read an email as if it were a novel. And then we have apocalyptic writings such as Daniel and Revelation. This is coded spiritual imagery and symbols meant to encourage, not a literal timeline of tomorrow's news. Okay, and that takes us to our whistle-stop tour of the 66 books. Okay, a word of warning, even though this is a whistle-stop tour of the 66 books, it is by no means a short lesson. So I recommend you pause the video here, go to the toilet if you need to, make yourself a drink, grab some popcorn or whatever snack you fancy, and settle in, because this is a marathon. I don't expect you to watch through the whole thing in one go. Feel free to watch this video in chunks because there is quite a lot to have to go through. You might want to make yourself comfortable, pause the video, grab a drink or something, because this is going to be fun and it's going to take a little while. All right. So Genesis through to Deuteronomy, otherwise known as the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses, which Jews call the Torah. This is the opening book of the Bible and assumes no prior knowledge of what happened. I'm talking about Genesis here. It's a riveting read, and the whole 5 books are fairly easy to get through. It reads just like a just so story in the beginning. How did the universe come to be? How come snakes crawl on their bellies? It then gets darker with Cain and Abel, and in the broadest possible brushstrokes can be seen as a descent of mankind from being created in the image of God to being totally depraved, to the point where the whole world needs to be flooded with only Noah and his family surviving. There are a number of genealogies to connect various stories, including the how and why humanity is divided into quarrelling and warring nations that just can't get along before finally settling in on one family, Abraham's, where we will trace through the books of Exodus through to Deuteronomy how God kept his promise to Abraham, making him into a great nation, how God's people were meant to be, and how they rebelled against him continually. Exodus and Deuteronomy give specific laws for the nation of Israel, and it's important to remember these laws were for a specific group of people at a specific time. There are also instructions for worship that do not apply to us today, but for advanced readers contain interesting parallels to Christian life. While many people ascribe the books to Moses, it was largely passed down in the form of oral tradition from the 15th to the 13th century before Christ, but were not finally compiled into a single narrative until somewhere around the 10th to the 5th century before Christ. Okay, a brief note on genealogies and census data. Navigating the genealogies. For the original readers, ancestry was everything. It was their legal deed to their land and their identity. But for a first-time reader today, these lists can feel like a massive roadblock. Don't get bogged down. If you hit a long list of names or census numbers, like how many people were in the tribe of what's its name, don't give up. Just skip ahead. You aren't missing the plot. The action and the big message of the Bible don't hide in the census results. It's not all or nothing. You aren't meant to master everything on your first pass. It's a lifelong conversation. The Bible is a book meant to be read over and over. Every time you return to it, a new insight will surface. And here's a pro tip. Treat the genealogies like the fine print or the credits of a movie. They are important for the record, but they shouldn't stop you from enjoying the story. And this brings us to Joshua, Judges and Ruth, which is also narrative history. The key part to remember here is the recurring phrase through Judges. In those days Israel had no king. So we know these events are being told from oral tradition by someone who is living in a time after the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. In Joshua, we read about the conquest of the Promised Land and the failure of the tribe of Dan to conquer their assigned territory, which creates problems down the road. These were pretty chaotic times. There were rulers after Moses, came Joshua, and then the various judges settled disputes and arguments, but there was no central authority. The idea was that God was the central authority, but as people rejected God, so chaos reigned. A cycle emerged of rebellion, followed by God handing his people over to their enemies for chastisement, followed by them regretting their actions and turning back to God. So God would raise up a judge or leader who would rescue them from their enemies into a time of obedience to God and a time of blessing until the death of that judge, when the people would once again turn away from God, and so the cycle would repeat. In the midst of this chaos, we enter the book of Ruth, which shows a very refreshing alternative in the lifelong faithfulness of Ruth, who wasn't even an Israelite, but a foreigner who demonstrated steadfast loyalty and unshakable faith and obedience that led to her being integrated not only into the bloodline of the Israelites, but the most important family tree of all, the one from whom came not only King David, but also the Messiah, otherwise known as the Christ. In our daily lives, we can often see similar patterns emerging on a microcosm of blessing, followed by self-reliance and pride, followed by chastisement and humiliation, followed by repentance, followed by blessing in a tiresome cycle. Or is that just me? Nevertheless, even though these stories are from the distant past and the regulations no longer apply to us, we can learn from their examples, and perhaps the greatest takeaway is just how extremely patient and how quick to forgive our God really is. It should be noticed that while these are just 3 books, they are covering an extremely long period of time, from around 1400 before Christ to around 1000 before Christ. That's a period of time that is roughly equivalent to the entire history of the USA, from the arrival of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower to the second term of Donald Trump. So while it might look like a fast-paced collection of extremely stiff-necked people who are slow to learn their lessons, we're really talking about 13 to 14 different generations of people. And that brings us to the 2 books of Samuel, the 2 books of Kings, and the 2 books of Chronicles, which is also narrative or history. Just as Deuteronomy reads like a summary of Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, so 1st and 2nd Chronicles reads like a summary of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, except 1 Chronicles begins with a genealogy starting with Adam and ending with King Saul, followed by a brief description of Saul's death, pretty much skipping over his entire life. This suggests the purpose of the 2 books of Chronicles is so that the returning Jews have a record of their genealogy and history for use after they return from the exile. Collectively, all these books tell the story of the monarchy of Israel and Judah, beginning with the establishment of the monarchy over the united kingdoms of Israel and Judah under King Saul, David and Solomon, to the parting of the ways between the 2 kingdoms and the fall of the 10 northern tribes, collectively called the Northern Kingdom or simply Israel, into idolatry and tenuous grasp on fidelity of the 2 southern tribes, that's Judah and Benjamin, collectively called the Southern Kingdom, or sometimes just Judah, ending with the permanent exile of Israel, having been handed over by God to the Assyrians in 721 before Christ, and the temporary handing over of the 2 southern tribes to the Babylonians in 586 before Christ. though 2nd Chronicles ends on the positive note that the 2 southern tribes were allowed to return under King Cyrus of the Persians in 539 before Christ. Collectively then, these books span the period from around 1000 before Christ to around 539 before Christ, a little under 500 years of history. The combined history of Genesis to 2nd Chronicles then spans a timeline stretching from the creation to around 500 before Christ. That's several thousand years of human history condensed into a few books. Okay, so why does all this matter? These books give you the history of the people of God, from the creation of the universe right up to the time of when the Assyrians and the Babylonians carted them off into exile. And that brings us to Ezra and Nehemiah, which is also narrative or history. And now we're leaving the main history writings as if they were told from the point of view of a historian compiling a history, and we enter the world of the returning exiles. These history books read less like a history book and more like a journal, suggesting that a scribe who may have been either Ezra or Nehemiah, or a contemporary of Ezra or Nehemiah, was the one who compiled all the previous books based on written records and oral traditions that they had access to. In fact, so similar in tone is Ezra to 2nd Chronicles that some people believe Ezra wrote the books of Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah read more like first-hand accounts of events that are currently taking place. Both Ezra and Nehemiah tell of the return of the 2 southern tribes and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. While Ezra is focused on the rebuilding and rededication of the temple, Nehemiah is mainly focused on the rebuilding of the city walls. Both books cover the period of history from around 538 before Christ to around 432 before Christ, a period of around 106 years, spanning the lives of 2 people who at least at some point seem to have been contemporaries. And that brings us to Esther, which is also narrative or history. One of the few books that are primarily about a female protagonist, and one of the only 2 books in the 66 books of the Protestant canon. We go back in time from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah to the time Judah was in captivity in Babylon. It deals with the political intrigue of one Haman, whose ambition it is to exterminate all the Jews. A faithful Jewish woman called Esther catches the king's eye and uses her position, as tenuous as it is, to save all God's people from Haman's machinations. This is the origin of the Jewish festival of Purim. Esther is covering a very short time period, roughly around the year 460 before Christ, though scholars suggest it was compiled sometime later, after the Feast of Purim was already well established. Esther is the final book in the section of history writings. The important takeaway from these are events that happened. They are not commands for what we should be doing today. There are some commandments, but those commandments were for a different period in a different culture. Okay, now we have a strange book here. It's also narrative or history, but it's very difficult to date. Some people place him as a contemporary of Abraham, making Job technically the oldest book of the Bible. So unsure are people of the dating for Job that it could be anywhere from 2000 before Christ to 1000 before Christ. The way Job behaves, and that his wealth is measured in cattle rather than currency, suggests he was quite ancient, and his long lifespan also puts his story somewhere in Genesis, before Israel was a nation, though many scholars agree that the book was written at a later date by an Israelite historian working from oral or written traditions. The oral traditions are likely extremely ancient, since the language in some places is so hard to translate that linguists don't know how to translate some of the texts, and several passages read very differently from Bible version to Bible version. This does not in any way detract from the overall theme of the book, however. The book ignores all forms of politics and history and focuses purely on the life of one man, Job, and reads more like a philosophical discourse on the nature of suffering and how a righteous person should handle loss and suffering. In the Protestant Bibles, Job is the first book of the wisdom section. So you see here, Job is bridging the gap between narrative and history and the wisdom writings. It's classed as wisdom writings because it's so very philosophical in nature, and yet it's also written as a piece of history. And this brings us to Psalms, which is poetry or wisdom. A collection of 150 songs composed by King David, the sons of Korah and Asaph, mainly King David. The sons of Korah and Asaph were presumably musicians in David's court, and we know David himself, besides being a king, was also a musician as well as a shepherd and a warrior. He used to play the harp for King Saul. In fact, so good was his music that when King Saul was being tormented by an evil spirit, David's music would soothe him. While there is some intense prayers and devotional hymns of praise to God, it is tempting to want to draw theology from the Psalms, but I would caution against it. It should be noted that these are the lyrics to songs and not intended as theological treatises. It's good to read the Psalms for spiritual comfort. Indeed, so powerful are David's words that even without the music to go with them, the words can bring comfort to the anxious soul today, just as much as they were able to bring comfort to King Saul in David's youth. We should be reading Psalms as a way to enlighten our prayer life with God and a way to calm our anxious hearts. But we should not be drawing formal theological conclusions from the Psalms. They are mostly written in hyperbole, and they're written in a way to communicate with our emotions. And that brings us to the book of Proverbs. King Solomon is said to have been the wisest person who ever lived. He collected a great many wise sayings from all over the then known world through all his trading and diplomatic encounters and gathered them together in a book of Proverbs. This book really should not be skim-read, and it can be very heavy going to try to read it all at once. So it's better to dip into it and read one or two proverbs at a time and dwell on them, though several of them do seem to repeat themselves or contain very similar themes. The majority of the proverbs are attributed to King Solomon. And that brings us to Ecclesiastes. While no author is attributed to the book, a simple reading strongly implies that the teacher, who was the richest and wisest man who tested life to see what was good about it, was almost certainly King Solomon, since nobody else really fits the description. The book implies that this great wisdom plunged him into a state of despair. With much wisdom comes much sorrow, is a quotation that he himself made. This book reads like a man with a great wealth, fame, women, and all the finest pleasures life could offer, struggling to find meaning in life. He drew conclusions like wealth is better than poverty, yet both are utterly meaningless. At the conclusion of the book, he says almost with a depressed resignation, "Fear God and keep his commands, because this is the whole duty of man." I often like to read excerpts from the book of Ecclesiastes and compare them with Jesus' words in Matthew 6, verse 25 to 34. Comparing the two can lead to some very profound insights, as if the two wisest beings to walk the earth had exactly the same conclusion, but with polar opposite emphasis. And then this brings us to the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon, and this is in the Poetry and Wisdom section. The Song of Songs is a collection of ancient love poetry. a very passionate and in some places downright erotic love poem between two lovers. It is structured as a dialogue between a beloved, the woman, and lover, the man. A chorus of friends, the daughters of Jerusalem. Unlike the rest of the Bible, which often focuses on history or morality, this book focuses entirely on the beauty of human attraction and the intensity of romantic love. It can be read through three different lenses. The literal lens. It is exactly what it looks like, a celebration of marriage and the goodness of physical intimacy. It serves as a reminder that the Bible views our bodies and our desires as part of God's very good creation. And then there's the allegorical lens, which is the Jewish lens. Rabbi Akiva famously called it the Holy of Holies. In this view, the man is God and the woman is Israel. It carries a honeymoon vibe, which represents the ideal, passionate devotion God desires with his people, even if the reality is often more complicated. And then there's the Christian typological lens. Many Christians read the man as Christ and the woman as the church. It is seen as a picture of the marriage supper of the Lamb and the sacrificial love Jesus has for his followers. Don't worry about trying to understand the metaphors immediately, like comparing teeth to a flock of sheep. It was a compliment back then. Just read it as a poem about the ache of missing someone and the joy of finding them. If you see God in that pursuit, great. If you see a beautiful human love story, you're still reading it exactly as it was written. And this concludes the section on the Old Testament known as wisdom and poetry. Again, wisdom and poetry are meant to be observations and general truths about life. They're not meant to be commands for us to follow. Okay, so this brings us to the section of the Old Testament that we call the prophetic books or prophetic literature. The next 5 books are known collectively as the major prophets. Not that they were more important, but that their writings were longer. Now we'll deal with them individually, as there are some background knowledge required before trying to read these books, without which much of it won't make sense. Now, I'm calling Isaiah and Jeremiah and the Lamentations of Jeremiah the pre-exilic major prophets, as they are concerned with the messages and warnings God gave to Israel in the years leading up to the exile to Assyria for the northern kingdoms and the exile to Babylon for the southern kingdoms. This occurred in the 8th century before Christ for the northern kingdoms and the 6th century before Christ for the southern kingdoms. Prophetic literature differs from history in that it contains warnings to the recipients directly from God, as well as predictions for things that will come to pass in the future. Prophecy can contain both prose, to be read literally, e.g. see-spot run type literature, and poetry, to be read as metaphor, for example, the cat in the hat. Mixing up these literary styles is one of the main reasons for misunderstanding in the reading of prophetic literature. So we're starting off the 5 major prophets with Isaiah, who's a pre-exilic major prophet. Now I'm calling Isaiah pre-exilic major prophet because he wrote a long book, hence major, and was writing before Israel and Judah were carried off into captivity, hence pre-exilic. Isaiah's prophecies probably date to between 701 and 681 before Christ. As a prophet, some of his writings were for a future people, though. During Isaiah's time, the kingdoms were divided between the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes, the kingdom of Judah. Isaiah was mainly writing to the 2 southern tribes, but his writings contained judgments against various nations, including the kingdom of Israel, as well as promises of restoration, and many of his prophecies are universal in nature. Isaiah contains some of the most famous promises from God about the coming of the Messiah, or Christ. Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. They both mean the anointed one, and they're referring to Jesus. And that includes the famous prophecy about the Messiah being born of a virgin or young woman in chapter 9, which was immediately fulfilled in Isaiah's time and later more fully fulfilled in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Isaiah also contains the Song of the Servant, which directly predicts Jesus' atoning death, burial and resurrection, and that's in chapter 53. And that brings us to the book of Jeremiah, or the weeping prophet, who's also a pre-exilic major prophet. He's actually writing during the decline of the kingdom of Judah, hence pre-exilic. While Isaiah previously comforted Judah against Assyria, Jeremiah warned that the Babylonian conquest was inevitable. He was branded a traitor for advising Judah to surrender to Babylon to avoid destruction. He was imprisoned by his own people and later freed by the Babylonians. He famously predicted that while the northern kingdom was lost, Judah would return to the land after 70 years of captivity. Okay, it's worth noting the Jeremiah 29:11 misconception here. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you." This is perhaps the most misunderstood verse in the whole Bible. So I'd like to warn you about this pitfall right from the off, so that you don't fall into this trap. This was a specific promise to the exiles in Babylon, not a blanket guarantee of a trouble-free life. Often misused as a prosperity gospel proof text, Jeremiah's own life, marked by poverty and persecution, proves that God's plans often include enduring earthly suffering. That does not mean you won't enjoy a prosperous life if you follow God with all your heart. It's just by no means guaranteed. That doesn't mean you won't have prosperity eventually, but the prosperity might not come in this life. As Jesus said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." That's in Matthew 6:19-21 in the NIV. While the prosperity was for a specific group, verse 13 remains a timeless truth. "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart," and that's in the NIV. This is because it's part of the very nature of God, which we can also see in Acts 17, verses 26-27. Jeremiah is also the prophet who predicted the end of the Old Covenant and the coming of the New Covenant. Jeremiah 31, verses 31-34, says that the new covenant, or covenant is another word for testament in this case, will not be like the old one, which was broken by the people, but this one would be written on people's hearts and minds, such that nobody will have to tell his neighbour or brother to know the Lord, because everybody will know him. In other words, God will not be accessed by means of a priesthood, but everyone would have direct access to God on a personal level. And the same Jeremiah is also attributed to the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is also sometimes known as the Lamentations of Jeremiah. It's the funeral song for a city. This book is traditionally attributed to Jeremiah and explains why he earned his nickname, the Weeping Prophet. If Jeremiah warned that the fire was coming, Lamentations is the sound of him sitting in the ashes after the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem. Though it feels like raw emotion, it is actually a highly crafted acrostic poem. The chapters follow the Hebrew alphabet. Each line begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet, showing that the author was trying to give a formal shape to his infinite grief. Now, this is not abstract theology. It contains disturbing, visceral imagery of the starvation and atrocities suffered during the siege of Jerusalem. You don't study Lamentations so much as you sit with it. It is the biblical permission to grieve deeply when everything is lost. A personal note, this is a book I hope you never truly understand. It is the cry of those whose homeland has been destroyed and who have been forcibly exiled. It is the sorrow of those who have literally lost everything. It represents the darkest night of the soul. So if you struggle to understand parts of Lamentations, be glad that you don't understand them. It does, however, contain a glimmer of hope. Even in the middle of this devastation, the famous line of the book appears in chapter 3. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And this is the last of the pre-exilic major prophets. And this brings us to the first of the post-exilic major prophet, which is Ezekiel. Some parts of the book are apocalyptic in nature. Other parts are straightforward prophecy, just like Isaiah and Jeremiah. This is the first of the major prophets to prophesy to the Jews who were in exile in Babylon. Ezekiel is arguably the most intense book in the Old Testament. While Jeremiah was the weeping prophet, Ezekiel is often called the street theatre prophet. He didn't just speak his message, he acted them out in bizarre symbolic ways. I call Ezekiel post-exilic, but really he bridges the gap between pre-exilic and post-exilic. He was prophesying alongside Jeremiah before the exile and was carried away into captivity and continued prophesying while in captivity. The early chapters of Ezekiel, just like Jeremiah, are predicting with excruciating imagery the sin and judgment against Israel and Judah, including Ezekiel having to lie on his side while eating cakes baked over human dung, also to walk naked through the streets to symbolize the people being led into captivity. Ezekiel sees a vision of God leaving the temple to indicate to the people that God has withdrawn his divine protection, leaving the temple vulnerable to being destroyed along with the rest of Jerusalem. In the later chapters, Ezekiel shifts to some rather difficult to understand or even visualize imagery of God. The whole point, though, is to comfort the people who have been led into captivity. Even though they are far from Jerusalem, they are not far from God. Ezekiel also promises that one day the temple will be restored, but to a first-time reader, much of the imagery can feel like a fever dream. Don't be put off if that imagery doesn't immediately make sense. You can always come back to it later when you've read the rest of the Bible. Now, the apocalyptic language. First-time readers often struggle with Ezekiel's wild imagery. Wheels within wheels, many-eyed creatures, eating scrolls. It's all a style of writing that a lot of us are unfamiliar with, and we really shouldn't let it bother us on our first read through the Bible. It's something we can dig into much later on. Okay, so the word apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning to uncover or reveal. These visions aren't meant to be blueprints for a movie. They are symbolic word pictures. For example, the many-eyed creatures represents God's omniscience. Basically, he sees everything. It's not like a literal monster. Although, for all we know, some spiritual creatures might look like that to our spiritual eyes, but the point is, this vision isn't intended to be taken literally. That brings us to the famous vision, the Valley of Dry Bones. This is the heart of the book's hope. Ezekiel sees a valley of skeletons that come back to life when he prophesies. This is not some weird form of necromancy. It's a metaphor for the nation of Israel, though by now the name Israel is used exclusively by the prophets for the 2 tribes of the southern kingdom, who are still technically Israel's descendants and have as much a claim to the name as the 10 northern tribes, but there is no longer a need to differentiate the southern tribes from the northern tribes. Though they felt dead in exile, God promises to breathe his Spirit into them and bring them home. So the key theme here, then they will know that I am the Lord. This phrase appears over 60 times. Everything Ezekiel does, no matter how strange, is to point people back to God's sovereignty. Okay, the major theological theme of the book is individual responsibility. The shift from we to me. While Isaiah gives us the gospel and Jeremiah gives us the new covenant, Ezekiel, especially chapter 18, provides the personal accountability required for both. In Ezekiel's time there was a proverb, the parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. This can be found in Jeremiah 31 verse 29. People blamed their ancestors for their problems. Jeremiah shut this down by saying God is making a new covenant, not like the old one. Ezekiel expands on this concept. He explains that God judges each person based on their own heart, not their father's sins or their nation's history. The clean slate doctrine. Ezekiel 18 describes a God who is more interested in your direction than your perfection. For the wicked, if a person turns from their sin and does what is right, God forgets the past, their history is wiped clean. And for the righteous, conversely, following God is a daily choice. You cannot coast on yesterday's good deeds if your heart has turned away today. And why this matters? It tells us that it is never too late to turn around, and your past does not have to define your future with God. And this brings us to the book of Daniel. Faith in a foreign land. Again, some parts of this book are apocalyptic. The setting, like Ezekiel, Daniel was taken as a young man to Babylon. However, Daniel lived in the royal palace, serving as a high-ranking advisor to both Babylon and Persian kings. Daniel is the model of uncompromising faith. Whether facing a dietary test, a fiery furnace, or a lion's den, he remained loyal to God, while being an excellent citizen of a pagan empire. Our chapters 1 to 6 are the narrative. The first half of the book contains the famous Sunday school stories. These are historical accounts of how God protects those who stand for him in a culture that opposes him. It is quite easy to read and needs little explanation. So as I said, Daniel's a book in 2 halves. Part 1 are the stories, they're relatable accounts of courage and God's protection. Part 2 are the visions. Chapters 7 to 12 shift to intense apocalyptic imagery, beasts, statues and mysterious timelines. So the survival guide for the visions: don't get lost in the maths. Many readers get stuck trying to calculate exact dates for the end of the world. The main point of these visions were given to show that earthly empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, rise and fall, but God's kingdom is the only one that lasts forever. The Son of Man. Daniel introduces a mysterious figure called the Son of Man, who is given all authority. This is the title Jesus used for himself more than any other. And I would point out that even great minds like Sir Isaac Newton got lost in trying to uncover the clues for the end of the world in Daniel and other places in the Bible. That was a colossal waste of time, because there are no clues as to when the end of the world will come. You will hear people all the time going in their Bible saying, oh, but the end of the world's going to be this date or this date based on what has been revealed in the Bible. There are no clues revealed there. The Bible explicitly states that not only does nobody know, but it states that we are not meant to know. So please don't get lost in the maths. Focus on what God wants of you. Don't focus on the maths of when the end of the world will come, because that is a pointless waste of time. Okay, so the continuing with the book of Daniel, what does Son of Man actually mean? Son of Man is one of the most layered phrases in the Bible, and its meaning shifts depending on who uses it and in what context. The key is the same words carry three distinct meanings across the Old and New Testaments. Son of Man is a title that can be used of an ordinary human, a prophetic representative, and a heavenly exalted figure. In Hebrew, Ben Adam, Son of Man, literally means human or mortal. In the book of Ezekiel, God calls Ezekiel Son of Man over 90 times. The point is to emphasize Ezekiel's human frailty in contrast to God's glory. It does not imply a messianic title here. It simply means you, human. In places like Psalm 8 verse 4, Son of Man is a poetic parallel to man, meaning a member of the human race. In Daniel 7, one like a Son of Man as a heavenly or exalted figure, one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and to him who was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. This figure appears human, but comes with the clouds, that's a divine motif, and receives everlasting dominion, and is worshipped or served by all peoples. The juxtaposition of the term Son of Man, representing human frailty and mortality, with the clearly divine context used in Daniel, is alluding to Jesus Christ, who has all the fullness of God in human form, which is why Jesus Christ used the term of himself, making it clear that when Daniel prophesied about a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, he was prophesying about Jesus. And the major theological theme of Daniel, while Isaiah gave us the Gospel, Jeremiah the New Testament, and Ezekiel the personal responsibility for our own actions alone, Daniel's main theological takeaway is the eternal and indestructible nature of the church. In Daniel's vision of the statue, Daniel 2, representing the successive kingdoms, we have the various human kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and finally Rome, before a rock comes and strikes the statue, destroying it and becoming a mountain. The rock that becomes a mountain is the everlasting kingdom of God, that is to say, the church, which, unlike human kingdoms, will never be destroyed. And Daniel is the last of the major prophets. And this now brings us to the section of the Bible called the minor prophets, although I should say that they're no less important than the major prophets. Their books are just shorter. That's literally all there is to it. So we have the pre-exilic minor prophet Hosea. Hosea was a prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember, this was before the Assyrians dragged Israel into permanent captivity, where they eventually settled and intermarried and assimilated into the various cultures they were deported to. In Hosea, God promises to bring Israel back to him and unite them with the kingdom of Judah, a promise that will ultimately be fulfilled through Jesus Christ and the church. Hosea lived out in a very personal way the relationship between God and Israel by marrying an unfaithful wife and loving her despite her infidelity. As she repeatedly left him for other lovers, Hosea kept forgiving her because of his love, even at great personal expense. Hosea used his personal heartbreak as a living comparison to Israel, who would keep worshipping other gods and then coming back to God, expecting him to accept them back after they were repeatedly unfaithful to him. It creates a very human and personal analogy to help us understand how God feels when we compromise our faith. It's not a trivial thing for God, it's a betrayal of trust leading to heartbreak. Hosea's ministry was exceptionally long, spanning approximately 750 before Christ to 722 before Christ. This means Hosea's ministry predates Isaiah's. For context, he was living out his sermon on infidelity to God during the reign of King Jeroboam II, which you can read about in 2 Kings 14, verses 23 to 29. And this brings us to the minor prophet Joel, who's also pre-exilic. Actually, some argue he might be post-exilic. Unlike Hosea, it's hard to pin down the dating for the book of Joel, which may have been before the exile, circa 835 before Christ, or it might have been after the exile, circa 500 to 400 BC, making it hard to pin down the historical context. Joel starts off warning that Judah will become desolate, but afterwards will be restored. The Apostle Peter draws upon the promise in Joel 2 that God will pour out his Spirit on all peoples in Acts 2, when the Holy Spirit comes on the day of Pentecost. And this brings us to the pre-exilic minor prophet Amos. Amos operated during the reign of Jeroboam II in Israel, that's the northern kingdom, around 760 to 750 before Christ. On the surface, things looked great. There was economic prosperity. Israel was enjoying a period of massive territorial expansion and wealth. There was political stability. Their traditional enemies, like Aram and Damascus, were weak, and the rising superpower Assyria hadn't yet arrived on their doorstep. And religious activity, the temples were packed and people were making plenty of sacrifices. Amos wasn't a professional prophet, he was a shepherd from Tekoa, a small town in Judah, the southern kingdom. He also worked with sycamore figs, a low-status, labour-intensive job. He was a working-class guy who had no stake in the political machinery of the day. Amos preached against the superficial success of the era, which was built on the rotten foundations of social injustice, religious hypocrisy, and false security. Does that sound familiar? And now this brings us to the post-exilic minor prophet Obadiah. So he was prophesying around the time of the exile or shortly after the exile. This is the shortest book in the Bible, just 21 verses long. He prophesied against Edom. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, aka Israel, who sold his birthright for some stew. There was a bitter rivalry between the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Israel for centuries. Written around the time of the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC against the Edomites, who, though closely related to the Israelites, not only stood by and watched as the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, carrying the people into exile to Babylon, but they actively helped plunder the nation. While the prophecies were against a specific people at a specific moment in history, we can still apply the meaning in our lives today. When your enemy falls, do not kick him when he's down, or God's anger may turn against you. Do not gloat, even in your heart, at your rival's misfortune, because this displeases the Lord. And now back to the time before the exile, the pre-exilic minor prophet Jonah. Now, this is a truly fascinating book, although if you ask me, it's a bit fishy. Jonah was a prophet in Israel around the time of Jeroboam II, that's circa 785 to 745 before Christ, making him a possible contemporary of Hosea. It's possible there were a few years of overlap between Hosea and Jonah, although it's possible Hosea picked up where Jonah left off. While Jonah was a prophet ministering in Israel, his place in the Bible was secured because of his mission to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, the same Assyria which would conquer and deport the 10 northern tribes of Israel in 722 before Christ. Somewhere between half a century and a quarter century before Assyria became the instrument of God's wrath against Israel, Assyria itself was on God's hit list. God sent Jonah, an Israelite prophet, to the very heart of enemy territory, telling him to go warn them that the God of Israel will destroy their capital city in just 3 days. Jonah's response was to run away and flee as far as he could. He was on a ship bound for Tarshish when God said, "Oh, no, you don't," and sent him back to Nineveh by way of a giant fish. Humiliated and probably smelling of fish guts, Jonah preached 3 days more and Nineveh will be destroyed. And this brings us to the crux of the book. The whole city repented and God's wrath turned away from the Assyrians. Jonah was most displeased and ran off into the desert to sulk. So God sends a giant plant to teach him a lesson about forgiveness. And this brings us to the pre-exilic minor prophet Micah. Micah was a man from a rural village who became a bold, often unpopular voice of conscience against the corruption of his time. The dating of his ministry is uncertain and could have been anywhere between 750 and 686 before Christ, with the balance of scholarly opinion around 735 to 700 BC. Which would mean he was prophesying during the reigns of the Judean kings Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah. He was likely a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea and Amos. For historical context, Jotham, that's 2 Kings 15, 32 to 38, gives us a summary of his reign, while 2 Chronicles 27 gives us a fuller account of his building projects and military successes. Ahaz, 2 Kings 16 details his idolatry, political alliances and temple alterations, and 2 Chronicles 28 is an expanded narrative of his unfaithfulness and Judah's suffering. Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18 to 20, that's chapters 18, 19 and 20, tells us of his reforms, Assyrian invasion and miraculous healing. 2 Chronicles chapters 29, 30, 31 and 32 gives us an extensive account of his religious reforms and leadership. Micah is famous for his harsh critique of the powerful who devise iniquity, Micah 2:1, and treat people with cruelty. He condemns false prophets who only say what people want to hear for a paycheck. He promises that God will not leave his people in exile forever. He envisions a remnant returning and a future peaceful kingdom centred in Jerusalem, where nations will beat their swords into ploughshares. That's Micah 4:3. This is the prophet who foretold that the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ, would be born in Bethlehem. That's Micah 5:2. And this brings us to the pre-exilic minor prophet Nahum. Nahum's very name means comfort. It might seem strange reading the book because there doesn't seem to be much that is comforting about the book, but his ministry is to comfort the kingdom of Judah, the 2 southern kingdoms, after the destruction and deportation of the kingdom of Israel, referring here to the 10 northern tribes. Just like Jonah, Nahum is prophesying the fall of Nineveh. However, unlike Jonah, Nineveh does not repent. Since the destruction of Nineveh is supposed to happen imminently, we can place the book of Nahum sometime before 612 BC, but not much before. This would place Nahum as the prophet who was ministering to Judah during the reign of Manasseh, which we can read about in 2 Kings 21 verses 1 to 18 and 2 Chronicles 33 verses 1 to 20. Unlike Hezekiah, his father Manasseh was a wicked king who turned his people away from God. The message to the unfaithful kingdom of Judah, though, is one of hope and comfort. In Nahum 1:12 to 13, God promises to free Judah from the yoke of Assyria and tells them to celebrate their festivals to the Lord because they need no longer live in fear. That's verse 15. Which brings us to the pre-exilic minor prophet Habakkuk. Unlike most prophets whose books are about the prophet delivering the word of God to the intended recipient, this book takes the form of a dialogue between God and the prophet, where Habakkuk gives his complaints to God and God answers him. The dating of the book is a little uncertain, but the prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians would place him around the end of Josiah's reign. That's around 640 to 609 BC, which we can read about in 2 Kings 22 to 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 to 35, or the beginning of Jehoiakim's reign, which is 609 to 598 before Christ, which we can read about in 2 Kings 23 verses 36 to chapter 24 verse 7 and 2 Chronicles 36 verses 4 to 8. This would make Habakkuk a contemporary of Jeremiah. It's possible Habakkuk himself was led off into captivity, as one source suggests Habakkuk was in Babylon with Daniel, but that source is disputed. The major themes of the book of Habakkuk is the problem of evil. How can a good God allow evil things to happen? Faith in the dark, not having all the answers but trusting in God's righteousness anyway, and patience in suffering, leading to one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, which is Habakkuk 3 verses 17 to 18. And now we come to the pre-exilic minor prophet Zephaniah. To understand the world Zephaniah was living in, you can look at the account of King Josiah's reign. The best place to start is 2 Kings chapters 22 to 23, which details how Josiah discovered the lost law of God and launched a massive campaign to clean up the corruption and idols in the land. For a parallel look at these events, you can also check out 2 Chronicles 34 to 35. These passages show you exactly what Zephaniah was seeing: a young king trying to turn the country around while the people were still struggling to shake off their old destructive habits. The core of the book isn't about complex theological puzzles. It's about a day of reckoning. Think of it as a house cleaning. The prophet is warning that because the leadership and the people have abandoned what is right, a time of painful correction is coming to clear out the rot. He paints a picture of a world where pride and shortcuts have pushed God to the sidelines, but the message doesn't end in the rubble. He promises that for the people who remain, those who choose to stay humble and honest instead of chasing power or fame, there is a future. They aren't just surviving, they are being prepared for something better. The main takeaway is simply this: don't wait for a crisis to check your priorities. Zephaniah urges us to be the humble ones, people who don't think they are better than everyone else, and who honestly look to God for direction rather than trusting in their own success. It is a reminder that while God is serious about fixing the brokenness in the world, he is also a parent who takes genuine delight in those who keep their hearts right. It's an invitation to stay grounded, stay humble, and trust that you are held by a God who is actively working to restore things, even when the world feels chaotic. And this brings us to the post-exilic minor prophet Haggai. So this is after the exile. Since this is taking place after the return from exile, for historical context you can check out the entire books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The actual dating of the book can be very tightly attributed to a very specific time period between the 29th of August, the first day of the 6th month, and the 18th of December, the 24th day of the 9th month, of 520 before Christ, the second year of King Darius. This is because the dates are clearly given in the book itself. The people had returned home, but were exhausted and discouraged. They stopped working on the temple, that is to say God's house, to focus on making their own lives comfortable. Haggai shows up with a blunt wake-up call. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses while this house remains a ruin? Haggai 1:4. He reminds them that they feel dissatisfied because they are putting their own comfort ahead of their commitment to God. And the takeaway here, when life feels like it's going nowhere despite all your hard work, stop and check your priorities. If you put God first, the rest of your life gains purpose. And then this brings us to the post-exilic minor prophet Zechariah. Again, since this is taking place after the return from exile, for historical context you could check out the entire books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we can't be exactly as sure of the dates here as we could with Haggai, but we can pretty tightly give the dates as the beginning of Zechariah's ministry in October or November of 520 BC, but his final prophecy we can only say it would have been sometime after 480 BC. Writing around the same time as Haggai, Zechariah uses vivid, colourful visions to share his message. If these images seem strange or confusing on your first read, don't worry, that's completely normal. These visions are like layers of an onion. They are there to speak to your heart immediately, while the deeper symbolic details are treasures waiting for your future readings. For now, focus on the big picture encouragement, rather than trying to decode every symbol. The message. Life was messy, and the city was still half built. Zechariah tells them, do not despise these small beginnings, Zechariah 4:10. He gives them a series of visions showing that God is actively watching over them and that a future king is coming who will bring true, lasting peace. And the takeaway, it's easy to get discouraged when you don't see instant results. Zechariah encourages us to stay patient and hopeful, trusting that God is working behind the scenes, even when things seem small or slow. And this brings us to the post-exilic minor prophet Malachi. Again, since this is taking place after the return from exile, for historical context you could check out the entire books of Ezra and Nehemiah, similar themes exist in Malachi as in Nehemiah, suggesting Malachi may have taken over from Nehemiah when Nehemiah returned to Persia. This would date Malachi's book to around 433 before Christ. There is some debate as to whether Malachi or Joel is the last prophet ever to appear in Israel before the coming of John the Baptist, the Elijah promised at the end of Malachi to prepare the way for Jesus Christ. Now the background, a few decades after the return from exile, the initial excitement of being home had worn off. People had become cynical and were just going through the motions with their faith. And the message, Malachi is like a mirror held up to a tired, bored community. He challenges their attitude. They were giving God their leftovers, the sick or crippled animals, instead of their best. He promises that God hasn't forgotten them and that a messenger is coming to prepare the way for a major breakthrough. And the takeaway, religious routine is dangerous. Malachi reminds us that God wants our hearts and our sincerity, not just our duty. It serves as a bridge pointing directly forward to the arrival of the New Testament. It should be noted that these books of the Bible were not originally bound together into a single volume and would have originally been read as separate works. They were later bound together, and only much later did people agree on what order they should appear in the Bibles. We should be careful not to put too much emphasis on the order in which the books appear in the Bible when it comes to deciding what order we are going to read the books. Malachi was deliberately placed at the end of the Old Testament by Christians because the final promise that Elijah would come back is fulfilled in the book of Matthew, which is deliberately placed at the start of the New Testament. They were arranged like this so that Christians have the cliffhanger ending of Malachi leading nicely into the New Testament, which makes for an extremely satisfying read. The original Christians had the Old Testament and the New Testament as completely separate works, and the books could have been arranged in any order. The order they appear in our modern Bibles has evolved over many centuries into something that most churches feel makes the most logical sense. It is not therefore necessary for our understanding that we read through the Bible in the order in which they appear. And that brings us into the New Testament. This is where BC becomes AD. There is a roughly 400-year break between the Old Testament and the New Testament. During this period, kingdoms rose and fell. The Greeks under Alexander the Great swept across the region, conquering all of the land previously occupied by Israel and Judah, stretching as far west as Egypt. Mesopotamia was no more. No Babylon, no Persia, no Israel, no Judah. Everyone was part of Greek territory. However, after Alexander the Great passed away, his kingdom was divided amongst his generals, the most important to our story being the Ptolemies, the last of the Ptolemies being Cleopatra, and the Seleucids, the most infamous being Antiochus IV, who desecrated the temple, leading to the Maccabean revolt, which gave way for Jewish independence for a brief while. After a while, though, a new and more powerful empire arose, Rome. This empire conquered the entire Mediterranean world as far as Britain at its height. It was under Roman rule that the New Testament picks up. Okay, so this brings us to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. This is narrative or history. The Gospels are accounts of Jesus' life and serve as an introduction to the New Testament. They are written under Roman rule, and unlike the Old Testament, which spans several thousand years, the New Testament all happened in a single generation. The Synoptic Gospels are so named because they see eye to eye, and there is so much overlap between them that some believe they copied each other or copied a common source. My own belief is that Mark's Gospel was written first by John Mark, who wrote down Peter's recollections of Jesus in a short, no-nonsense gospel which ended abruptly. Due to that abrupt ending, Matthew decided to finish his work and add his own embellishments from his own experiences and memories, while Luke, acting as a historian, wrote his gospel based on his hearing of stories and perhaps from seeing both Mark and Matthew's gospel, judiciously using both sources, but also throwing in stuff he heard from oral tradition. Luke continues after the Gospels left off, though, with a follow-up book called Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, which we'll look at after looking at the Gospel of John. It is my belief that these Gospels were all written sometime prior to 68 AD. It is believed Luke wrote both his Gospel and the book of Acts to defend Paul, who was in prison at the time, and history records him executed in 68 AD, and Luke relies on both Matthew and Mark, so it's a safe inference that all three were written before 68 AD. And this brings us to the Gospel according to John. Again, it's narrative or history. Written by the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee and brother of James, together known as the Sons of Thunder, John describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was the only apostle to survive into extreme old age, so he wrote his gospel much later than the synoptic gospels, which is why it reads so very differently. The church was facing very different issues at the time John wrote down his gospel. When reading all four Gospels, it's important to understand that writing biographies back then tended not to be too concerned with chronology as they are today, and events tend to be arranged more thematically than chronologically. That is to say, events that happen towards the end of someone's life might be moved to earlier times to emphasize a pattern or theme, while the vague order of events is preserved. For example, a person must be born before they die. The exact order in which a person does things is not always preserved. Unlike the point of the synoptic gospels, which seems to be proving that Jesus is the Messiah, as well as making sure it's understood that he died and was buried and was raised from the dead, John's gospel tends to focus on the divinity of Jesus Christ, which is why it is often recommended as the first book read by new Christians. Since most new converts to Christianity aren't Jewish, the detail of how Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses is of secondary concern to the important message that Jesus is God in the flesh, who made atonement for our sins on the cross and came back from the dead. Due to the more theological nature of John's Gospel, I tend to agree with most scholars that the Gospel of John was written fairly late, probably around 90 AD. And that brings us to the book of Acts, which is also narrative or history. The book of Acts, short for Acts of the Apostles, serves as the second volume of a two-part work written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. While the Gospel of Luke tells the story of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, Acts tells the story of what happened next, the birth and rapid growth of the early church. So what's the story about? Acts traces how a small local group of Jesus' followers transformed into a movement that spread across the Roman Empire. The narrative follows two primary leaders. Acts follows the works of Peter. He takes the lead in the early chapters, helping to establish the foundational community of believers. The narrative later shifts to focus on Paul, a former opponent of the movement who had a dramatic conversion experience. Most of the book follows his travels as he plants new churches across the ancient world. A note on the ending. The book ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, waiting for a trial before the emperor. It does not record his death. Because the Bible stops there, historians rely on external traditions to guess what happens next. Some believe he was released to continue his travels, while others believe he remained in custody until his execution. For the reader, however, the book's ending emphasizes the message of the faith reaching the capital of the Roman Empire rather than the specific biography of his messengers. And this brings us to the book of Romans, which is an epistle or letter. This is the first of the letters written by Paul to the churches. In this case, it is written to the church in Rome. Most scholars believe Paul wrote the letter to the Romans around 57 AD, while he was in Corinth. By now, the Roman Church was well established and contained a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish Christians. The resulting tensions is the major theme of the book, the most famous parts being the law makes us aware of sin and the impossibility of ever being justified under the law, and the need for grace. Romans 14 also goes into a great deal of detail about not using our freedom from the law to cause other people to stumble. And this brings us to the two letters to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is written around 53 to 54 AD, and that's written from Ephesus. Paul had received reports of division and specific questions from the church he founded a few years prior. And 2 Corinthians, written around 55 to 56 AD, written from Macedonia. This letter is much more personal and emotional, written after a painful visit and a period of severe tension between Paul and the congregation. The culture of Corinth. Sin City. To understand the letters, you have to understand the city. Corinth was the New York City, or Las Vegas, of the ancient Roman world. It was a strategic hub located on an isthmus. It was a massive trade centre. It was wealthy, transient, and fiercely competitive. As pluralism and morality, the city was home to the temple of Aphrodite. The term to Corinthianize actually became ancient slang for engaging in sexual immorality. And they were obsessed with status. Roman Corinth was obsessed with social standing, oratory skill, and wisdom. This created a church culture that struggled with pride and looking down on those with less, quote, spiritual, unquote, status. And this brings us to the book of Galatians, which is also an epistle. An epistle is a letter, so it was written for a specific set of circumstances. Likely written around 48 to 49 AD, this makes it one of the very first letters Paul ever wrote. The book of Galatians deals with one of the very earliest controversies the newly formed church had to deal with. Known as the Jew-Gentile controversy, a bunch of Christians who were Jewish tried to insist that the Gentiles, or non-Jews, converted to Judaism fully before being allowed to become Christians. This was resolved in Acts 10 and in Acts 15, but was still a problem at the time Paul wrote to the church in Galatia. Indeed, the problem hadn't truly gone away even when Paul wrote to Rome. The Galatians were a group of people known for their volatile and impulsive nature. They had initially received Paul with open arms, but were easily swayed by these new teachers who claimed Paul's gospel was incomplete. The debate centered on law versus grace. In the ancient world, many religious systems were transactional. If you do X, Y, and Z, the gods will look favourably upon you. Paul was essentially trying to convince them that the transaction had already been completed by Christ. And this brings us to the book of Ephesians, which is also a letter. The book of Ephesians was likely written around 60 to 62 AD by Paul while under house arrest in Rome. While addressed to the saints in Ephesus, many scholars believe it was intended as a circular letter to be shared among several churches in Asia Minor. Ephesus was one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire. It was a massive trade hub and home to the temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The culture was defined by religious pluralism. It was a centre for pagan worship, magic and idol manufacturing, and cosmic anxiety. In that era, many people lived in fear of powers and principalities, supernatural forces they believed controlled their fate. Paul's message was a direct challenge to this, emphasizing that Christ is supreme over all these powers. Paul spends the first half of the book, chapters 1 to 3, focusing on who we are in Christ. He argues that God's plan is to unite everything, heaven and earth, under Christ. A major focus is the breaking down of the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles, forming one new humanity. The second half, chapters 4 to 6, shifts to practical application. If you have been made new, how do you actually live? The armour of God. This is likely the most famous section, Ephesians 6. Paul uses the imagery of a Roman soldier's gear to describe how to stand firm in spiritual challenges. And this brings us to the book of Philippians. Philippians is often called the Epistle of Joy. Unlike the corrective tone of Corinthians or the theological intensity of Galatians, Philippians is essentially a thank you note from a mentor to a group of friends who were supporting him while he was in prison. It is warm, personal, and remarkably encouraging. Likely written around 60 to 62 AD, Paul wrote Philippians from prison in Rome, just as he wrote Ephesians. Paul wrote this letter to the church in Philippi, which was the first church Paul established in Europe. They were a very special group to him. They were the only ones who consistently sent financial support to help him in his ministry. Now, the key takeaways: in chapter 2, Paul quotes what is believed to be an early Christian hymn. It describes how Jesus, though he was God, emptied himself to become a servant. It is one of the most profound descriptions of humanity in ancient literature. Paul wrote this letter from prison, a place of darkness, uncertainty, and potential execution. Yet the words joy and rejoice appear constantly. Paul's point is that true joy is not based on your circumstances, which are temporary, but on your relationship with Christ, which is eternal. In the final chapter, Paul speaks about having learned the secret of being content, whether he was well fed or hungry, in plenty or in need. It is a powerful lesson on finding peace that is independent of external comforts. And now this brings us to the book of Colossians. Colossians is the philosophical twin to Ephesians. While Ephesians focuses on the church as the body of Christ, Colossians zooms in on the supremacy of Christ himself. Paul wrote this to correct a specific kind of spiritual confusion creeping into the church. Written roughly 60 to 62 AD, this is another prison letter like Ephesians and Philippians. The church in Colossae was situated in a smaller city in Asia Minor than Ephesus. Interestingly, Paul did not actually plant this church. It was started by his co-worker Epaphras. The believers in Colossae were being pressured by a mix of local religious influences, a cocktail of Jewish legalism, early Gnosticism, an emphasis on secret mystical knowledge, and local folk religion that worshipped elemental spirits. People were telling the Colossians that Jesus was nice, but that they also needed secret knowledge, strict asceticism, denying bodily needs, and the worship of angels to be truly complete. And the key takeaways: Paul counters the heresy, which is a false teaching, by writing one of the most dense, powerful, Christological passages in the entire Bible, Colossians 1:15 to 20. He argues that Jesus is not just a way, but the image of the invisible God, the creator and the sustainer of everything. Paul's main rebuttal to the false teachers is simple. You don't need anything else. You don't need secret rituals, extra visions, or strict adherence to man-made rules to be perfect or spiritual. In Christ, the believer is already full and complete. Paul finishes the letter by explaining what this means for daily life. He warns against empty philosophy and tells them to put on new character traits: compassion, kindness, humility, and forgiveness, like changing out of old dirty clothes into new ones. Why it matters. Colossians is a vital reminder of sufficiency. In a modern world filled with endless hacks, self-help philosophies, and competing worldviews that promise to make us better, Paul's message is a grounding force. If you have the reality of Christ, you aren't missing the secret to life. You already have the foundation. And this brings us to the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are two of the earliest letters written by the Apostle Paul. They offer a fascinating time capsule into the life of a brand new church, struggling to figure out how to live in a culture that wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for them. Our first Thessalonians, the encourager. Paul wrote this letter around 50 to 51 AD, shortly after leaving Thessalonica. He was worried about the new believers there, but Timothy brought back a glowing report. They were doing great despite the heat. And the vibe is warm, fatherly, and relieved. Paul spends a lot of time high-fiving them for their faith. And the big question: the believers were worried about friends who had died before Jesus returned. Paul reassures them that the dead will rise first. And the key theme here is holiness and hope. He encourages them to live quiet lives and stay sexually pure while waiting for the return of Christ. And 2 Thessalonians is the clarifier. A few months later, Paul had to write a follow-up. It turns out the Thessalonians were too excited about the end of the world. Someone had even told them Jesus had already returned, and they were freaking out. The vibe is more stern and corrective. He's essentially saying, deep breaths everyone, let's look at the facts. And the big question: if Jesus is coming back any second, why should I go to work? The key theme is order and endurance. Paul explains that certain things, like the man of lawlessness, must happen first. He also famously tells those who stopped working to get back to their jobs, saying, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. Why they matter today. Both letters deal heavily with eschatology, that's the study of end times. They provide the foundation for the Christian hope in the resurrection. On a more practical level, they are great examples of how to maintain your integrity and work ethic even when the world around you feels chaotic. And this brings us to the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy. If 1 and 2 Thessalonians are church letters, then 1 and 2 Timothy are mentor manuals, known as the pastoral epistles. These are deeply personal letters from an aging Paul to his younger protege, Timothy, who was tasked with managing a difficult church in Ephesus. From here on, we get letters to church leaders rather than letters from Paul to churches as a whole. Timothy was a young and inexperienced church leader going up against older, more learned, false teachers who were eloquent and persuasive. Timothy was the leader of the church in Ephesus. Ephesus was the home to the temple of Artemis, and the people of Ephesus passionately defended her honour. Paul instructs Timothy to be courageous and speak the truth despite these obstacles, as well as giving him instructions on how to run a church. Their estimated dates are 62 to 67 AD. Tradition holds that Paul was released from his first Roman imprisonment, the one mentioned at the end of Acts. He then travelled again, possibly to Spain or back to Greece, and wrote these letters during that final window of freedom and a subsequent second imprisonment. 1 Timothy, circa 63 to 65 AD, written while Paul was travelling through Macedonia after leaving Timothy in charge of Ephesus, and 2 Timothy, written between 66 and 67 AD, written from a much harsher Roman prison, likely the Mamertine prison. He knows his execution is imminent, which matches the historical record of Nero's persecution of Christians ending around 68 AD. And why they matter today. These letters bridge the gap between Jesus was here and how do we run this organisation for the long haul. They provide the ethical and structural framework for almost all modern church leadership. And this brings us to the book of Titus. Titus was another one of Paul's proteges, but his assignment was a bit tougher. He was left on the island of Crete, which in the ancient world had a reputation for being, well, a bit of a mess. Paul even quotes a local poet in the letter who says, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. While Timothy was leading a full-fledged church, Titus was planting a brand new church. This is what Christians are expected to do when they find themselves all alone and unable to find a suitable church. The letter is short, only 3 chapters, and punchy. It's all about order and integrity. And the vibe is practical and no nonsense. Paul is giving Titus his marching orders to clean up the chaos in the Cretan churches. And the big problem, the churches were disorganized and being led astray by rebellious people and empty talkers. Paul and Titus travelled to Crete together. Paul left Titus to finish the job and wrote this letter from somewhere in Macedonia, likely shortly after writing 1 Timothy, to tell Titus to meet him in Nicopolis for winter. The dating of the letter then would be circa 63 to 65 AD. And this brings us to the book of Philemon. Buckle up, because Philemon is a total shift in gears. While the other letters we've discussed are manuals or blueprints, Philemon is a private, high-stakes postcard. It is the shortest of Paul's letters, only 335 words in the original Greek, and it's arguably his most tactful and sneaky piece of writing. The story behind the letter is like a first-century legal drama. Paul is writing from prison, likely in Rome or Ephesus. Philemon is a wealthy Christian leader in Colossae who hosted a church in his home. Onesimus is a slave who belonged to Philemon. He had robbed his master and fled, but bumped into Paul and became a Christian. And the dilemma. Under Roman law, a runaway slave could be executed or severely branded. Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, but he's sending this letter with him to ensure Philemon doesn't punish him. And the vibe. Awkward, persuasive, and incredibly clever. Paul uses every friendship card in the deck to get his way. The dating of Philemon is either circa 60 to 62 AD, in which case Paul was writing from Rome, or circa 54 to 56 AD, in which case Paul was likely writing from Ephesus. I personally prefer the earlier date, as it seems more likely that a runaway slave would have made it to Ephesus than all the way to Rome, but either date works, and neither date significantly changes the understanding of the book. Philemon is the last of the letters written by Paul. All these letters from Romans to Philemon are called the Pauline epistles. And this brings us to the book of Hebrews. This is a challenging read for anyone unfamiliar with the Old Testament, and is often skipped by a lot of Christians. They really shouldn't, but many do. It's probably best to skim read it on your first read through and come back to it after reading the Old Testament. It stands between the Pauline epistles and the general epistles because the unnamed author writes in the style of Paul, leading to some debate as to who wrote the book. The two primary contenders are Paul, who didn't write his name on the book because he was persona non grata among the Jewish people the book was written to, or it was written by one of his close companions, most likely Barnabas, who was a Levite and very familiar with the Jewish traditions and the temple practice. The author is writing to Jewish Christians who were being pressured by society and the state to return to traditional Jewish practices. They were exhausted, discouraged, and considering giving up on their new faith to return to the safety of the old ways. And the vibe. A passionate, urgent, and heavy argument. It feels like a sermon intended to keep the audience from falling asleep at the wheel. The big argument. The author methodically goes through the pillars of the Old Testament: angels, Moses, the priesthood, the temple, and the animal sacrifices, and shows how Jesus acts as the better version or the fulfillment of all of them. Since the book argues that Christ is the fulfillment of the temple rituals, it's most likely the book was written prior to the destruction of the temple, or perhaps writing in the immediate aftermath of the temple destruction to console the people who felt the devastation of losing the temple. This would place the dating of the book prior to 70 AD, or at the very latest, exactly 70 AD. If the book was written in 70 AD, it couldn't have been written by Paul. If it was written by Paul, it must have been prior to 68 AD. Hebrews is the ultimate don't give up book. It connects the dots between the history of Israel and the mission of Jesus, arguing that Christianity isn't a new religion, but the fulfillment of the old one. And this brings us to the book of James. The book of James is a tough love book of the New Testament. If Hebrews is a high-level theological lecture, James is a series of short, sharp, practical lessons delivered over coffee. It's widely believed to have been written by James, the half-brother of Jesus, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. The letter doesn't spend much time on complex theories. Instead, it's laser focused on how your faith should change your behaviour. James has often been called the Proverbs of the New Testament because it's full of punchy, memorable wisdom. And the vibe is direct, confrontational, and deeply practical. It's the put your money where your mouth is book. The big problem: James was seeing believers who claimed to have faith but were acting no differently than the people around them. They were showing favouritism, gossiping, and ignoring the poor. James is one of the most interesting books to date because it feels very early. The likely date is around 45 to 48 AD. Most scholars believe this is the earliest written book of the New Testament. James keeps Christians honest. It serves as a necessary reality check against the idea that believing in God is just an intellectual exercise. It insists that if your faith doesn't change how you speak to your neighbour or how you treat the poor, it isn't the kind of faith that the gospel describes. And this brings us to the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. Peter, also known as Simon or Cephas, was one of the first disciples Jesus called and one of his closest companions. Jesus called him Peter, meaning rock, and said, "On this rock I will build my church." Most scholars date 1st Peter to around 64 to 65 AD and 2nd Peter to around 66 to 67 AD. 1st Peter is written to the Jews of the diaspora, that is to say the Jewish Christians scattered around the nations. As Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, so Peter was the apostle to the Jews, which really shows God's character, sending a humble fisherman as the apostle to those who have been brought up under the law, and a well-educated Pharisee to those who couldn't really give a toss about the law of Moses. God tends to use our weaknesses to glorify him, so that we can't say we did it on our own strength. Most scholars date 1st Peter to around 64 to 65 AD and 2nd Peter to around 66 to 67 AD. 1 and 2 Peter are the survival guides. Peter is writing to people who are essentially being treated as outcasts or criminals just for being Christians. If James is about how to live, Peter is about why you can keep your head up while the world around you is turning against you. The letters of 1 and 2 Peter are fascinating because they offer a window into the transition from the generation that walked with Jesus to the generation that had to build the church without him physically being present. They are quite different in tone. While 1 Peter is a warm pastoral hug in the face of external pressure, 2 Peter is a sharp, authoritative warning shot against internal decay. These letters are incredibly relevant whenever culture feels hostile to faith. 1 Peter teaches us how to live with dignity when we are misunderstood, and 2 Peter teaches us the importance of maintaining doctrinal clarity when everyone around you is saying it doesn't really matter what you believe. And this brings us to the books of 1st, 2nd and 3rd John. The letters of 1, 2 and 3 John, often called the Johannine epistles, are a trio of writings that shift from deep theological reflection to the nitty-gritty of church politics. They were written by the elder, traditionally identified as John the Apostle, the last living eyewitness to Jesus' ministry. These letters were likely written around 85 to 95 AD, written from Ephesus late in John's life. 1 John, the anchor of truth, unlike the other two, this isn't really a letter in the traditional sense. It's more of a circular sermon or a manifesto meant to be read to several churches. 2 John, the protective letter. This is a short, sharp note addressed to the elect lady and her children, which most scholars believe is a metaphor for the specific local church. The key themes is not to entertain false teachers. And 3 John, the conflict of power. This is the most personal letter in the New Testament. It is a private note to a man named Gaius. A man named Diotrephes, a powerful, hungry leader, had taken control of a local church. He was refusing to welcome John's messengers and was excommunicating anyone who tried to help them. John writes to Gaius to support the good guys, Demetrius, and to condemn the gatekeeping behaviour of Diotrephes. These letters give us a glimpse into the community that was undergoing a traumatic breakup. Imagine a church that had been together for decades suddenly splitting because of intellectual pride and internal power struggles. John, as the aging mentor, is trying to hold the remaining faithful core together. Antichrist. John uses the term specifically for those who deny that Jesus is the Christ. And the new commandment, he keeps circling back to the commandment to love one another, which he reminds them is not just a suggestion, but the litmus test of their relationship with God. And this brings us to the book of Jude. The book of Jude is the warning siren of the New Testament. It is short, intense, and reads like a man who has seen a wildfire approaching and is screaming at his neighbours to get out of the house. Jude, who identifies himself as the brother of James and therefore half-brother of Jesus, originally intended to write a letter about their shared salvation. He changed his mind halfway through because he heard about a crisis in the church which required immediate, heavy-duty intervention. A group of people had infiltrated the church and were using the concept of God's grace as a license to live however they wanted, specifically through sexual immorality and rejecting authority. Because Jude references the apostolic teaching as something that happened in the past, remember the words spoken by the apostles, Jude 1:17, it suggests that most of the original apostles had already passed away or were no longer present. It is thought, therefore, that it was likely written around 65 to 80 AD. While this letter was meant to be circulated widely, the reference to Jewish traditions, such as the story of Michael the archangel and the body of Moses, strongly suggests the intended recipients were Jewish, and the identification of Jude as the brother of James, who was leader of the church in Jerusalem, suggests the book was likely written somewhere in Judea or the surrounding regions. Jude is the filter for the church. It reminds readers that not everyone who claims to be a Christian is actually operating under the authority of Jesus. It is a call to discernment, to be wise as serpents while remaining innocent as doves. And the last of the 66 books is the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. So it's an apocalypse but also an epistle. It's basically a circular epistle written in the apocalyptic style. Think of it as a circular letter written to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, dictated by the risen Christ but penned by the Apostle John. Secure in the knowledge that my advice in previous videos and earlier on in this video to leave Revelation alone until the very end of your biblical study is going to be ignored, here are some key things to know about Revelation. The book of Revelation uses vivid imagery to speak directly to the heart, bypassing the brain. Even if you don't understand the references, the central theme that God will win the ultimate battle of good versus evil and the whole world will be judged, and that no matter how advanced human technology has become, we can't stand against God, should come through clearly enough. While the rest of the Bible tells us that Jesus will return to judge the world, Revelation graphically shows us that it will happen and how futile it will be to try to resist. The book tells us exactly who wrote it and where it was written from. John, the apostle from the island of Patmos, a Roman penal colony. There is visceral debates between those who favour the early writing, pre-70 AD, and those who favour a late writing around AD 90. This matters a great deal to the interpretation of the book. Understanding the book can be broken down into 5 main schools of thought. Preterist, the belief that all the events of the book have already been fulfilled and the second coming of Christ happened in 70 AD. Futurist, the belief that these events are speaking to the modern times and that they will be fulfilled at some point in the future. Idealist, the belief that these events are not meant to be interpreted literally but will be metaphorically fulfilled over and over with each generation. The various visions stands for concepts and are various ways of showing how good will ultimately triumph over evil. And the historicist, various ways of interpreting Revelation as showing the unfolding of human history from the point of view of God. And eclectic, favoured by many commentators, the book of Revelation can be viewed through any number of interpretive lenses, and we should not confine ourselves to any one way of reading the book. However you choose to interpret the various visions and signs of the book, please keep an open mind about how your understanding of the book might change as you read the rest of the Bible. And this brings us to the Apocrypha. The books I have gone through are the basic 66 books of the Bible known as the Protestant canon. These are the books all Christians agree upon. In the more advanced videos, I talk about the process of canonization and discuss the apocryphal books. These are the extra books found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, which you might have found. Some churches believe those extra books are inspired, while other churches do not consider them to be inspired by God. They are classed as good for reading, but not divinely inspired. For simplicity, I will leave them out of the video and ask you to reserve judgment on the apocryphal books until after you have read the 66 books that everyone agrees upon. I know that was heavy. I know that was a lot to take in, but having some background is essential before diving into the Bible. While it contains timeless truths, it was not originally written for 21st century readers. Much of the content was specific to that time and culture, so we must approach the text with an awareness of the authors, the original audience, and the historical context that precipitated the writing. Many people fall into serious traps because they misunderstand these settings. For example, they may take poetry or apocalyptic visions too literally, or they might rip text out of their context by trying to make them directly applicable to today without considering the original intent. While some advice in the epistles contains universal truths, other portions were intended only for specific situations. We wouldn't, for instance, be waiting for a runaway slave to return to us in the 21st century, as that directive was specific to a man named Philemon. However, we can still apply the underlying principles of forgiving past offences and welcoming those who have hurt us back into our circle. This is why having a more mature mentor is so important. They can guide our study until we are equipped to read the scriptures effectively and eventually mentor others ourselves. So where do we go from here? We have laid the groundwork today, but as you begin to explore the Bible and visit different churches, you're going to run into some insider language, words like exegesis, dogma, and the all-important difference between the gospel and the gospels. In our next session, part 4, we're going to cut through a lot of jargon that a lot of people can find off-putting. I'll translate that church speak into plain English so you can confidently navigate your own study and understand exactly what people are talking about when they ask you to preach the gospel, so you don't accidentally start reading a long genealogy to a stranger. I'll explain churchisms like Eucharist, ecumenical, and academic terms like hermeneutics and exegesis in simple terms so that going to church or reading a commentary on the Bible doesn't feel like trying to learn a foreign language. It's my hope that it will make going to church and reading the Bible a whole lot less intimidating. And that's it for today. Congratulations if you made it this far. Much respect. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next session.